So I am with Richard Woods. He's a catamaran designer based in the UK, and we've been having a series of conversations about elements of catamarans that you might not think about. So we've had quite a few great conversations, so feel free to look through the list. But today we are talking about pointing and whether or not cats can point, because there's a real a myth, I think, about catamarans and their inability to point. But I, having sailed around the world on one of Richard's designs, can let you know that we pointed probably better than a lot of the monohulls we were with. So we'll let Richard explain why some catamarans point and some don't.
Well, I think you're not really interested in pointing ability per se. What you're actually trying to do is get to windward as fast as you can into the eye of the wind. What people say is VMG, speed made good to windward. And you can do that in two ways. You can either sail fast and then sail faster, or you can point or point higher. And the problem with a monohull is that you can't go any faster, and effectively it's the waterline length that's going to determine your speed. So the only way you can get to windward faster is to point higher. And if you compare, the America's Cup at the moment is being sailed in 75-foot foiling monohulls. And if you look at their tacking when the two boats cross, you'll see that their wake is at about 90 degrees. So they're actually only tacking through 90-degree angle. The fact that they're doing 38 knots is why they go to windward so fast. Whereas going back, because not people don't know this, but your husband worked for Bruce Farr on America Cup boats in the 90s, didn't he?
Yeah.
And they would tack through 65 degrees between tacks at 9 knots. So the pointing argument is, oh, well, it must be better because it did tack through 65 degrees, but it only was doing 9 knots rather than 35 knots. And so the thing with a multi-hull is that you can go faster. And so you don't actually need to point so high to get to windward quickly. And so it is, as you say, it's a bit of a myth. And you've got to say, well, can I go to windward quickly? Is essentially what you're trying to do. But there are lots and lots of examples of multi-hulls that do sail well to windward and will point higher than a monohull. One being, for example, my 32-foot Eclipse catamaran that I talked about before, with dagger boards and racing in that before we went off cruising. Ran the island race with the Mum 30 monohulls, and we went round the lee mark with a group of Mum 30 monohulls in 20 knots of wind, and we overtook them to windward. And they've got carbon sails. We had a solid fuel stove. We had dinghy and davits. They were racing boats. We were a liveaboard cruising boat, and we have essentially the same length. But we could point higher and sail faster. And there's lots of examples like that. Another one I did was on a Schoening 38, sailing straight past Beneteau 38 when we were racing. And yeah, it happens all the time. But a lot of people don't sail their catamarans properly. And one of the main things that they don't do is have enough sheet tension, particularly the main sheet, and particularly if they've got a square top mainsail. You've really, really got to pull that on. We used to have, on a 35-foot catamaran, we used to have an 8-to-1 main sheet that we then took to a 40-to-1 winch, and we would winch it on as hard as we could. And that's the sort of load that you're probably looking at to get a nice tight leach and be able to point. And that's doesn't really matter what the design of boat is. However, you can make a boat sail very badly to windward by having not very good sails. Even though with the better sails, it would sail well.
That's an interesting point, because I more about sail trim, but also sail quality is, I know sail trim is really taught for monohulls. So when people go out and learn how to sail and learn about sail trim and learn about how they're supposed to set the sail, that's really a monohull specific skill set. And I don't know how many people are actually taught that catamarans are sailed differently. And most of us learn that through trial and error, but there are some very specific guidelines that probably would be useful for catamaran owners to learn as they go.
Well, fortunately, these days, there are a lot more catamaran specific sailing schools. There's a very good one here near me, Jim Durden, with Top Cat Cruising. And he's got a privilege now. He used to have a Beneteau or Blue 35-foot boat, and he had one of my 35-footers. And he's been doing that for a long time. And he will go and sail with you on your own boat and teach you how to sail it. Because yes, there are lots of differences between sailing on a monohull and sailing on a multi-hull. And in some ways, in that sense, it's if you're new to sailing and you start on a multi-hull, you haven't got the old monohull habits to forget first or unlearn, have you? So, and I started sailing on dinghies, and the sailing between a dinghy and a multi-hull is probably more, has more in common than sailing a monohull to a multi-hull.
That makes sense. So is there anything else we should cover as far as pointing and going to windward?
Yeah, as we said earlier, the dagger-boarded boats make a huge difference. Sheeting angle, quality of sails. And one of the other things is that with a multi-hull, you can, people like, you think, oh, I'm going really fast. But what you're actually doing is close reaching rather than sailing to windward. And you've always got to try edging up a bit. And you've got the telltales of the jib that you're always going to keep an eye on, and ideally have the windward one just lifting slightly, so then you know you're sailing as optimum to windward. But then, yeah, compared to a monohull, it's what we were saying earlier, that if you've got a keeled multi-hull, you've got to consider it like a long keel monohull, and a dagger-boarded boat like a fin keel boat. And you can't really compare the two, whether it's the long keel monohull and the fin keel monohull, or the two catamarans. But and then there's another thing I would say, though, that if surprisingly, if I said I want to guarantee to beat a monohull the same size, I would want to do it when it was windy and rough. And you might think, oh well, a catamaran would go much better in flat water and light winds, but in fact, the multi-hull will keep going and powering on long after the monohull has reached the top speed. And then all the monohull can do, because the waves is going to stop it from pointing too high, is it's going to heel over, and it's not going to go any faster. Whereas the multi-hull will carry on going faster and faster. And that, of course, is another of the problems that you can do. You can basically sail the boat till you break it.
Yes,
Which
overpower
is less
them.
likely to do in a monohull.
For sure. Yeah, no, overpowering. You start to hear the difference when you're overpowered. And we always found we'd reduce sail and we'd actually go faster because we weren't stressing everything as much. But
yeah, one of the things on a monohull is that you would sail and you say, well, the gunnels just tipping under. So this time the reef. And you don't have that sort of thing on a multi-hull because you're basically upright. And so you do need to be much more aware of how windy it is and what the sea state is. And so that's always a good idea when you've got your boat is to try pushing it to see what your limit is, so that if you said, and again, going back to the eclipse, when we were day racing with a very experienced crew, we had full sail in 34 knots of pound wind. When we were cruising with 2 people, we would reef in 25 knots.
Wow.
But the 35 knots of the true wind, I mean, a pound wind with full sail, that's really, you're really pushing, doing 10 knots. To windward.
Well, that's fascinating to talk about pointing. It definitely brought up a few things that I hadn't thought about. So thank you for that. And this will be part of a long series of different topics that we're covering with Richard. And I want to thank him for spending time with us today.
That's good. Yeah.